Let's take a look at the first of the 4 criteria that we have as part of the items that we need to complete in order to recognize revenue from a transaction. This is the evidence of arrangement. So we need some sort of contract, some sort of agreement between the customer and the vendor. Generally, we'd expect that to be something in writing, although if you're doing business with a retailer over the internet, perhaps you just have the web pages and the entering of your credit card data and an acceptance of terms. So you may not have a written contract. But typically we would expect some sort of written contract, a quote from a vendor to a customer, a purchase order from a customer to a vendor, an order confirmation back from the vendor saying, yes, we got your order and these are the terms and conditions under which we're selling to you. All those things would be the evidence of an arrangement. In a significant transaction, it might be a contract that could be hundreds of pages. In a simpler contract, it could be just a purchase order or a quote that the vendor issues to the customer and the customer signs. There might be a master agreement and then purchase orders against that master agreement. So there's lots of different ways the seller and the buyer would document what the nature of the transaction is, the amount that the transaction is for, what the customer is purchasing. And the type of evidence will differ by company, by the type of transaction, what the vendor is selling, what the customer is buying. Different business units of a company might use different evidences of arrangement. There might be a web unit and a unit that sells significant equipment for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars with long written contracts, whereas the web business might just have a click-through type of arrangement. Also, different regions and different cultures, different industries, all are going to have different standards of how they document the transaction. The important thing is that the evidence of the arrangement exists for the transaction from both the vendor and the customer, that it's complete, that it's signed or executed or clicked through and completed in order for us to have the evidence of an arrangement. So we need to have that in order to start the revenue recognition process. So typical evidence of arrangement, as I said, will there be some sort of contract or agreement, and it would cover the basics of the transaction. What products or services is the customer purchasing? What's the dollar or the denominational amount of the transaction? What are the payment terms? Is it 30 days due? Is it cash up front, prepayment, 60, 90 days, whatever? What are the shipping terms? If there's a tangible product that's being delivered, does it become the customer's when the vendor hands it off to the carrier, or does it become the customer's when the carrier delivers it to the customer? What sort of warranties and other after-sale services might be part of that transaction? Are there options for future pricing or future purchases that might also be enumerated in the transaction? And then a host of other clauses like infringement, so that if a vendor sells something to a customer, that they can't be held responsible if it infringes upon the rights of other vendors who created that product. Just how long the contract terms are for, how a contract can be terminated. There are numerous items that are covered in these types of contracts, and often the particular commercial terms are an attachment or an exhibit to that contract. What sort of rights does the customer have? Do they have rights to refunds if certain things don't happen, if the products don't perform as specified? All those are the sorts of terms and conditions that would be included in the typical contract or other document that would serve as the evidence of the arrangement. If we've got a software or intellectual property license that's part of an arrangement, we'd expect to see a license agreement, like a software license agreement that says we're marketing this software to you, we're licensing it, and what are your rights under that license? Typically, for an intellectual property license or a software license, it's just the ability to use that technology, not the right to resell it, not the right to reverse engineer it and incorporate it into other products. So those are the sort of things that are often documented in the license agreement. And this may be just a click-through agreement that the first time you activate the software, there's that I agree or don't agree screen that comes up with the multiple page terms and conditions that most people don't read, but enumerate the rights of the purchaser and the rights of the seller. As I said, typically software or IP is not owned by the customer, but is merely an extension of a right to use the software or the IP. And there's typically some period of time that's associated with that license, either in perpetuity with a perpetual type software license. Once you buy it, you have the right to use it. Or for intellectual property or for software, maybe a term license. You can use it for 1 year or 2 years or some specific period of time. Those would all be items that would be documented in the evidence of the arrangement in the contract or other form of agreement between the seller and the customer. Now, the evidence of arrangement is not always clear. As a revenue recognition accountant looking at transactions, there's lots of things that can cause us to lack clarity in arrangement. One of them, of course, is conflicting terms and conditions in the various written documents. So the vendor issues a quote, and let's use a very simple term so we can understand it, that says the payment terms are 30 days. The customer returns a purchase order with all the other aspects of the transaction exactly the same as the quote, but says the payment terms are 60 days. So then we'd have a conflict between the two documents, and we'd have a battle of the forms situation where we'd have to determine which one of those two documents governs the transaction. Is it the 60-day terms of the purchase order, or is it the quote with the 30 days? Or is there a subsequent order confirmation from the vendor saying these are the terms and conditions that we're confirming for the arrangement and has the 30 days in it? So some of those would be legal questions that you'd be best versed to have an attorney inform you on. But typically in basic business law, you have an offer, counteroffer, and the last document that's part of the transaction stream of the evidence would be the prevailing one. But it may not be that. So you need to be very careful when you have conflicting terms and conditions in a quote. Sometimes, unfortunately, especially in longer contracts that are standard contracts perhaps that are modified or ones that are drafted between the two parties, sometimes the terms and conditions conflict within the document. So on page 5 it might say one thing, and on page 25 it might say another. And this presents, of course, a problem for revenue recognition accountants to determine what are the terms that govern this transaction so that I know how to apply the revenue recognition guidance to the transaction. In addition, the business terms might not be completely or clearly spelled out. I find this to be particularly true when a business introduces a new model and hasn't fully had the experience of how that model actually works between the customer and the vendor over time, and there may be aspects of the commercial terms that aren't explicitly thought out and documented in the evidence of the arrangement. And of course, that once again makes it very difficult for an accountant to determine how to recognize the revenue from a transaction. Then we have this situation, which we'll talk about in more detail on Thursday in our other revenue recognition issues section, where sometimes we have multiple contracts with a customer, and we need to determine, do we recognize these as one contract, or do we recognize revenue from them as multiple contracts? Because depending on the terms and conditions of each one of those individual contracts, it could very significantly affect the revenue recognition for the contracts. If they're looked at as a whole and one of them has significant discounts and those discounts get applied to all the elements of the arrangement, then the initial one of the contracts, if we recognized it separately, might have a higher value. If we've got multiple contracts and we determine that they are one contract for accounting purposes and one of those contracts hasn't been signed yet, well, then we don't have a completion of our evidence of arrangement. As we did mention, all of the evidence of the arrangement needs to be complete, agreed to by the parties, signed, in order to meet the evidence of the arrangement requirement. So if you've got two contracts that are linked and one of them is signed, at the end of an accounting period you haven't signed the second contract, you would not have evidence of arrangement and you would not be able to recognize revenue for the first contract. I think we should come up with our second polling question now, trying to keep these rolling at about every 15 minutes or so. So we'll pop another one up and see if we can get 100% on this one as well. The four principles of revenue recognition include evidence of an arrangement, fixed and determinable fee, delivery of performance, collectability, all of the above. Let's see if we can get 100% polling and 100% correct, since we did just cover this shortly ago. Everyone's paying attention this morning? Looks like it. They're both awake and understanding what we've talked about. So, working with evidence of arrangement, so sometimes it's difficult to actually get all the pieces of the arrangement evidence together and then be able to read through it and completely understand the terms and conditions of the contract and any conflicts that that might be in there, that might be ambiguities that we have to make assumptions or decisions about how we're going to recognize the revenue. Particularly if we've got contracts that flow over many years, where we have a master contract that keeps getting amended, or we've got a contract and we modify that contract by adding or deleting items that are in the contract and subsequent amendments to the contract. All those things can really significantly impact the decisions that we make about how to recognize the revenue from the transaction. In addition to the written portion of the contract, sometimes there are business which become a term of the arrangement. For example, if a vendor has a business practice of always refunding money to customers if they're not satisfied with a product, particularly within a period of time, well, then that would be a term that we would need to take into consideration in our determination of how to recognize the revenue. If a business has statements or policies or practices that are enumerated on their website, those might become elements of the arrangement, part of the evidence of the arrangement, even if they're not in the written contract that was signed. So if there's a contract that doesn't have anything about refunds in it, but on the company's website it says satisfaction 100% guaranteed, return the product within 30 days for a full refund, even though that wasn't part of the written contract between the vendor and the customer, it would be part of the evidence of the arrangement and therefore would need to be considered when we take the steps to recognize the revenue. Similarly, if a business has a practice of providing technical support and maintenance to customers without charge for products that they've purchased, then we need to consider whether that was an element of the arrangement that we would need to take into account when we do the revenue recognition for the transaction. So all these things are part of the evidence of arrangement. We need to know and understand what the terms of the deal are, what are we selling, how are we going to do the revenue recognition in order to do the nuts and bolts accounting with the debits and credits for the transaction.